third speaker is John Lloyd, the Chief Executive of, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's currently Horticulture Australia Limited, but it might be about to change. Okay.
Thanks, Mick. Yeah, it's current. Well, I'm not sure what it is at the moment, but I think it's currently Horticulture Australia Limited, and it'll be Horticulture Innovation Australia Limited when we are the declared industry services body, possibly at the end of this month. What Mick asked me to do was to just give some examples of what I think are the innovations that we can deal with in horticulture. Over the next 10 years, it will cause significant leap in productivity and profitability, farm gate profitability for our growers. For those of you not familiar with the horticultural sector, this pretty much describes it with a couple of exceptions. It's a homogenous product. It's largely undifferentiated in the domestic market. There's a significant lack of investment in the global market. We grow every single horticultural crop in the world that you can grow, and we grow them commercially in Australia for a population somewhat less than the population of Shanghai, on a land mass the size of the lower 48 states. So clearly we've got market failure in critical mass just about everywhere, particularly in production, processing, R&D and marketing, and that's about it really. We've got a weak export focus, with some exceptions. Our nut industries are progressing extraordinarily well when it comes to exports, and some of our niche industries do well as well. We have intense domestic price competition. That's the name of the game for us. In New Zealand, it's export or perish. In Australia, it's rip your neighbour's throats out or perish. There's a high ease of entry and exit, particularly for row crops. It's very difficult in the vegetable industry. A guy can be a vegetable grower one day and a broadacre grower the next. And then you've got the straddle products like corn or sweet corn. It's considered to be a vegetable. And it's increasingly segmented and changing consumer preferences. And in our particular case, we do grow food, not agricultural product. In many cases, there's zero processing that takes place between what is picked off a tree and what is consumed by the consumer. So it's a somewhat different paradigm than the rest of agriculture. That said, it's a sector worth about $8.5 billion a year. We don't count wine grapes as part of that. If we did, we'd be the second biggest agricultural sector in Australia. Major deficiency in our sector and in others has been lack of focus on catering adequately for broader frontier research. The fact of the matter is most farmers, 80% of farmers, pay 80% of their levy to fix the problem tomorrow that they stubbed their toe on yesterday. And that's fair enough. But it can't really stay confined to that. In aiming to provide tangible ROI for the levy dollar, the investment focus has been on shorter-term, safer, core and incremental R&D. And there's a very strong need to focus on core transformational needs. We need to set aside significant amounts of money for this industry to take the next step forward, to reduce the labour component in pre and post-harvest activities, to look at novel methods to overcome abiotic and biotic stresses, novel ways to add value post-harvest, and developing a very strong export culture of high-value niche products. And as an example of that, I was recently in India, and anyone who goes to India would know that you stay in the very best place you possibly can, otherwise often you don't get out. And I stayed in a place in New Delhi called Leela Palace, and I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but it's probably the most magnificent place I've ever stayed in. And as a matter of interest, we went into the kitchens because the food was superb. And we went into the kitchens and we asked them in the kitchens where they got their food from, and they said, well, lots of places except one, India. Not one item of food in this kitchen other than bananas, which came from Kerala province, and it's pretty safe. Not one item of food in that hotel was sourced from India. And there was a whole heap of Australian and Canadian and Scottish product and all the rest there. So obviously that's the target for our exporters. Look, back in Mick's day and my day, we're of the same vintage. Will Robinson was the equivalent of Game of Thrones, I suppose. That's what we used to sit glued to. But looking at this right now, I would have to say that one of the most important things we can invest in is automation. We are the highest labour cost country in the world. There's no doubt about it. And when we have products like horticultural products that are actually labour intensive, we have to invest in automation, robotics and mechanisation. As soon as you say that, everyone talks about robots. But it's not really about robots. It's more about the type of work that's done in terms of robotics that adds further dimensions to your enterprise. And we've talked a lot about technology in the last couple of days here. But the reality is that we've developed a number of robotic models, and they're still being continued now, particularly in consultation with the Centre for Field Robotics, Salah Sukaraya at Sydney University. But it's more than putting a robot in the field. We look at modern orchard layout and tree architecture, and we know that, for instance, that's got to align with robotic platforms. We can't deploy these new robotic platforms on 30-year-old variable architecture in orchards, for instance. Where reality dictates that labour will never be fully replaced. However, the high labour rates and lack of skilled employees dictates that we've got to invest in automation. Imagine if you'd have gone to a car conference in 1970 and you said there would be hardly any workers in your plants by 2010. That most people probably would have laughed you out of the room. But in fact, that's exactly what's now happened. And I think we're getting to the same stage when it comes to particularly intensive agriculture. Some of the things that are holding us back are a lack of commercial investors, row crops somewhat, but certainly tree crops, we don't find them at all. And there needs to be a significant financial critical mass to be built up to overcome many of the financial, regulatory, practical and social obstacles that inhibit the development of these types of technologies. As a little bit of an example there, the work that Salar's doing is financed across large parts of horticulture, but a singly big investment comes from the almond industry and the apple and pear industry. And more recently, Salar was using some technology scanning blossoms in an apple orchard. In fact, he mapped every single flower in an apple orchard. And then he went back afterwards and mapped the fruit in the apple orchards just prior to harvest. And then he correlated the transition from flower to fruit, and he mapped the deficiencies. And what he found was a significant part of the orchard, for no reason that anyone could work out, showed about half the yield, yet the flower set was exactly the same. And of course, once you started to follow this pattern, you worked out that there had to be something to do with bees. And then there was a change in the bee box location at the next harvest, and that was corrected. And what we found was, for still unknown reasons, bees just didn't like that part of the orchard. That's probably a whole series of research that can be done later on. So there's a whole new world that's opening up when it comes to robotics. I've set them a task of selecting, picking and packing a ripe mango from a tropical mature orchard, which brings in all the elements of remoteness, of smell, sight, touch, shape, labour at heights and all these other issues. The next one is gene technology with respect to insects, and I think this is the single most exciting thing that we're dealing with right now. We've seen gene technology in plants. We've got the chance to do the same with insects. What we are doing is looking at inserting a dominant lethal gene which confirms female lethality, but I actually left out of here, and male sterility. What we do with this is we put the gene into a particular population through a particular linkage of the gene that we put in there. The diet is laced with tetracycline. When the tetracycline is withdrawn from the diet, all the females die. Sorry about that. And all the males are left, and then the males are genetically sterile and virile, much more virile than probably irradiated males. This is proven technology. It's now being used to control dengue fever mosquitoes and pink bollworm in the United States, mosquitoes in Brazil. We can use this technology to significantly enhance the adoption of other more sustainable IPM techniques by significantly suppressing populations in the field. And in fact, in Australia, the first thing we'll do with that is do a proof of concept with Stablefly in Western Australia, funded by royalties for regions. We're going to see what happens. I don't think there's a Save the Stablefly Society in Western Australia, so we're probably looking at community opposition being at its lowest. But if we can do the proof of concept in Western Australia for Stablefly, which is a peri-urban pest, and it's a big community issue, so there's plenty of money there to do it, we'll then extend it to Q-fly. And I want to stress here, Q-fly is our problem. Medfly is the world's problem, and it's funded by governments all around the world. Hundreds of millions of dollars funded into Medfly and other, olive fly control and that type of thing. Q-fly is uniquely ours, and we have to solve it. And Q-fly is actually quite unique as well. So we're investing quite heavily in this whole Q-fly issue. But the need is to breed about 100 million steriles a week. And of course, that's also quite different to the type of breeding that takes place for Medfly. And we're looking at building a facility in South Australia to do that. The biggest facility we have for sterilisation, either through X-ray or radiation at the moment, is about, practical sense, about 7 million a week. And that's not near enough to do a mass suppression program. Just as an aside, Q-fly is the single biggest barrier to export trade in horticultural produce. It's worth at least a minimum of about $250 million a year in terms of the total cost, if not more. So it's worthwhile solving, and it's probably one of the biggest productivity boosts and profitability boosts that we can have. Of course, the same technology extends to bumblebees. And I don't know if many of you know that just recently the federal government knocked back the application in Tasmania to take the bumblebee off the noxious pest list. There are bumblebees in Tasmania. They're a feral population. The genetics is not good. But it's illegal to take a bumblebee nest from outside the front door of your glasshouse and put it inside the front door of your glasshouse because it's a noxious pest. And so the domestication of the bumblebee is actually prevented in Tasmania. I'll talk about that now because this is the next area, I think, where we can get the greatest productivity growth in Australia. Protected cropping, I think it's the next big thing. It's expanding about 4 to 6% per annum in Australia, and of course it's not just confined to growing tomatoes up at Guyra, but down to things like the nursery and garden industry and other industries as well. It's valued at about $1.3 billion at farm gate. It's environmentally sound, it's a responsible growing system. It produces local foods, particularly close to urban environments. We know that, for instance, carbon dioxide has shown yield increases of some 30%. If you do it in a controlled environment, there's an opportunity through manipulation of both temperature, humidity, CO2, and one of the most exciting ones is LED light and the various spectrums of LED light that can be used on that. As such, we're co-investing in a centre of excellence for glasshouse production with the University of Western Sydney. It's good to see the universities are actually delineating themselves into areas of speciality here. You talk about Sydney University being probably one of the top 2 in the world in terms of field robotics. You've got somewhere like University of Western Sydney saying, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to do protected cropping. So we've done that in collaboration with the Dutch government as well. And that's very exciting development because that's where we can showcase these technologies. Bumblebees is really interesting. You can do all this, but at the end of the day, if you've got a heavily pollinated crop and you don't have bumblebees, you are way behind world standard. The classic way of pollinating glasshouse tomatoes at the moment is you've got a bloke in a cherry picker and you've got wires strung amongst the runners and you go along with a piece of polypipe and you bash the wires. True, the most advanced glasshouses in Australia still have that technology because we have no bumblebee. If you put a bumblebee in, you would immediately get between a 17 and a 20% increase in labour productivity, and you would get between a 15 and a 20% increase in output productivity. Why? Well, because if you're producing truss tomatoes and you're relying on accidental air pollination, then one half the truss might get pollinated and 2 days later the other half of the truss gets pollinated and it becomes an unsaleable product because they're all uneven. Whereas when it comes to the use of a bumblebee just works its way around in sequence. So you get a much more uniform pollination taking place. So again, I don't want to stress on the bumblebee issue, but we think we can put a bumblebee in Australia which is genetically modified, which is a bit like Monsanto's lethal suicide gene. These things can't do anything if they ever get out. We've just got to invest somewhere between $5 and $10 million to do it. And most of the major glasshouse producers in Australia are willing to contribute to that. We can't do everything at once, so that's probably the next thing on our list. So look, at the end of the day, protected cropping is not going to replace the farming acres, but it's going to enhance production in an extraordinarily large way and add flexibility to year-round supply. So Mick, that's all I had. Thank you.